Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first in a series of free webinars hosted by Enercon Engineering's Integrated Defense Solutions Business Unit, or IDS for short. I'm your host, Sean Lott. I am the Director of Business Development for Enercon IDS. We had the idea to start this webinar series based on the success and feedback of our initial webinar, The Importance of Power Integration Solutions. If you missed that webinar, you can view it on demand at the link posted in the chat box. Now, before we get started, feel free to ask questions during the presentation by clicking the Q&A tab located on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom or top of your screen. All questions will be addressed after the presentation portion is completed. As a reminder, this session is being streamed live on Facebook at Enercon Engineering, as well as being recorded for on-demand viewing at a later date. Now I'd like to introduce to you today's presenter. Nick Keever is the Vice President for Enercon IDS. His business unit specializes in providing U.S. defense partners with power integration and enclosure solutions. Nick has 21 years of power integration and packaging experience. His business unit currently produces the prime power unit for the THAAD missile defense system in support of the Missile Defense Agency's ballistic missile defense strategy. So without further ado, Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about some of the breakdowns and actions we can take on some of the common things that we see in this domain. The first one we're going to talk about is commercial off-the-shelf versus mil-spec. Some common breakdowns we see is the program office and the engineering community have different expectations for the program. Maybe the engineering community is looking to meet the customer needs in a certain technical way, where the program office and the original scope with the client was to leverage commercial off-the-shelf or COTS as much as possible. Typically, we can see that as a breakdown if they're not aligned. The next one is when you're looking to use COTS and you just need to change one thing to make it work for the program. Just changing that one thing can bring in a whole host of different requirements onto the supply base. So really understanding the impact of that and when it needs to be leveraged is important. And then also sometimes there's just no COT solutions for portions of the system. So, understanding those and making sure that requirements are understood is important. Some actions you can take for these things is ensure that the program office is aligned with the engineering community. As the engineering community is developing the specification, make sure the mission's clear between both parties in terms of what's trying to be achieved to satisfy the client. Another action that can be taken is to understand how modified COTS are impacted by other requirements. Once you modify that COTS piece of equipment, there can be a significant amount of requirements that flow down, and that's where you may see that $50 COTS part turn into a $5,000 part. So understanding that in your solicitation team, as well as making that sure that that's clear, the requirements down, is important as well. Also, work with all parties to know the requirements that the supplier is obligated to for non-COTS supply. Making sure that when you have those requirements that the supply base is all on the same page. One, ensures that the evaluation criteria for the solicitations are known by all, and it also ensures that the program will have success when working with those non-COTS part supplies. All right. So the next one we see sometimes is weight and transportability requirements. And I know some people that pre-registered had talked about questions around this. So we'll touch on that a little bit here. Some common breakdowns is that weight allocation is determined by the client prior to the specification development. So there may be a weight target that really isn't aligned with the need from the specification. The next one is that the engineering community thinks they're going to use or leverage specialty materials to meet the weight target. Those specialty materials can sometimes have significant minimum buys because the steel foundries will only do certain runs, and also a significant cost as well, and lead time with those materials that may not be considered in the original program plan. Another breakdown that we see is insufficient time to perform necessary weight calculations. When the proposal team's working at a supplier and you have a tight weight target, it's challenging, or it takes time to do effectively a good weight calculation. The supplier would need to get a flushed out bill of material with weights for every component that's going into the integration. And if you're working with 5,000, 8,000 part bill of materials, you can see how that can take some time to pull all that together. And then also the engineering side of, fabrications and that can take time. And even things like calculating paint weight when you're on a tight margin can be impactful. And the other one that we see sometimes is the freight costs and timelines are not considered for large equipment. So some actions you can take in this regard is work with the clients to understand what is driving the weight target. So when, if a client says 80,000 pounds is the weight target, and then you develop the specification and all their other needs, and, if they made it 90,000 pounds, you wouldn't need those specialty materials, then have that discussion with them. What drives the 80,000 pounds, and work with them on there to see if maybe they have the flexibility to go to 90,000, and maybe they don't, and sometimes you don't, but having that flexibility is important. Another one is action can be taken is to ensure the engineering community understands the impact of those material choices on delivery. If you need a high yield strength tube and you go to the mill and get the tube, it's going to take, maybe you only need 400 feet. One example we had is our min buy was 8,000 feet. So we had 20x the requirements for one integration that we had to buy as a minimum just to get our hands on that material, not to mention the long lead time to get that from the mill. So those are some of the things to really make sure that the engineering community understands as they're developing the specification. Then discuss with potential suppliers their timelines to do sufficient weight assessments. So when they're in that proposal work, have that open discussion with suppliers. And I would encourage you to make that a significant part of your supplier evaluation for the winning proposal, because due diligence there can save pain later. And then work with the freight companies prior to the solicitation to understand equipment logistics. We've moved very large equipment over 100,000 pounds, over almost 60 feet long, over width and height limitations. And, as you are developing the specification, really partner with a freight company to help you understand what it's going to take to be able to move that equipment. All right. So the next breakdown we see sometimes is in first article requirements. A lot of times people just don't understand what a first article inspection really entails and its impacts on the program. It can be very significant. Some other common breakdowns in there is the supplier may not understand the full requirement sets. They may not understand what needs to be submitted with a proper FAI package for a particular customer, because it does vary by customer sometimes. And then first article inspection requirements as specified, you may be able to interpret it multiple ways. And that can create conflict in the team once they're in execution. And it can also cost significant time and dollars based on the interpretation that wins out. And then first article tests from the engineering community may not always be value added. That can be a breakdown that you see as well that drives cost and schedule. So some actions to take. Request FAI training for the solicitation team. A lot of organizations have quality departments that understand their needs for first article inspections and the needs of their clients. Take the time to get everybody that's going to be evaluating the proposal that training in what FAI means. Ensure the full set of requirements for first articles are clear and not just a specification reference. We've seen examples where one interpretation may be that the first article inspections are to the lowest level inseparable assembly. So if you have a base weldment, that you would do the first article to just that weldment level. And then there's maybe another interpretation, well, no, all the individual piece parts that are welded together to form that base need a first article inspection on them as well. We've seen it both ways. And you go from doing one first article to maybe 20 to 30 first articles, depending on the part and the fabrication. So it's things like that you want to be clear on, so that way the client, the client, your organization, and the supply base all understand where they need to move forward. One way to do this is include an example of a complex assembly first article inspection package in your solicitation. That sets the expectation clear. It has all the forms, whether it's AS 9102 that you're leveraging or some internal requirement. Include that in the solicitation, then everybody has a clear understanding of the expectation that this is the level and this is the requirements for it. Another action that you can take is work with the supply base to review testing requirements. So the supply base are experts in their field, and they understand what customers typically require to be able to meet the requirements to validate the equipment that they provide. It may not be 100%, but they may have some feedback that says that this test really isn't going to be value added for you, and here's why. Maybe there's already factory testing that's been done. Maybe that another test is done to really test the same functionality. So that's always an opportunity to save cost and schedule in your testing on development products. All right. And then finally, required analysis, demonstrations, and tests. Some common breakdowns we see here is that there's an over-specification by the engineering community, and that some of the product validation requirements are unclear or costly to execute. And it's really taking the time to understand those impacts of executing some of those requirements. And then testing requirements are translated to lower assembly parts sometimes. So an example may be if you have a COTS component and you have a shock requirement, and that shock requirement, you don't really have the necessary or acceptable documentation from the COTS supplier that it will meet the shock, then does that shock testing go down to that lower assembly, or do you just do it at the top level and see if it breaks? You know, so once you take it down to the component level and you're doing it on every component that you don't have the clarity, that becomes very significant in the cost impact and time to the program. You go from a $500 part to maybe a $15,000 part to harden it, plus another $20,000 to get it on a shaker table. So, you know, you can see how it can compound very quickly. So some actions you can take in this regard is review the verification matrix to ensure that customer requirements are met. Review product validation requirements for clarity and ask how they would be executed. So when you're reviewing those validation requirements and how they be executed, that's where you kind of get into, okay, is there expectation for a shaker table test for the shock load on this part? You know, work that with the team to understand that those are all done. And also ensure the verification matrix is clear to what level of testing requirements flows. That's going down to that second tier like we talked about. And then drive testing requirements to the analysis level where practical. And this kind of goes into the first action of reviewing the verification matrix to ensure the customer requirements are met. You know, you try to get rid of the nice to haves, and that helps save some of the cost and schedule. So partner with the engineering community in the program office and say, you know, are we accomplishing the mission with these sets of validation criteria? And if we are, then those nice to haves can be drivers that you try to eliminate from the verification requirements, and driving the testing requirements to the analysis where practical can be a compromise. So if there's a test that says, okay, we want to execute, maybe there's an analysis that is just as confident that you can do, and analysis typically are less costly than tests. All right, with that, Sean, I think we're ready for some questions.
All right, thanks, Nick. That was some great insight on how specific requirements can impact cost and delivery. We really appreciate that. We do have time to answer some questions. So if you haven't taken the time yet and you do have a question, you can still submit a question to Nick by clicking the Q&A icon at the top or bottom of your screen. With that said, we do have a few questions here, so we'll start off with the first one that focuses on delivery and freight issues. So based on your experience, are there other ways to cut delivery freight issues to prevent cost overruns?
Yeah, it's a good question. When you're looking at the program that you're specifying or the assembly or integration that you're specifying, there's certain things, height and weight, that really drive transportability requirements in terms of over the road. So you try to minimize those as much as possible to still accomplish the mission of the product. Further, partner with your freight companies. I can't encourage that enough early in the process. We have freight companies that we partner with that we move very large equipment, and we do that early in the process, not just from a costing standpoint, but also from a scheduling standpoint to understand some of those routes I talked with earlier. So that would be my recommendation, is minimize the overall package dimensions, especially in height and weight, as much as possible, and then partner with those freight suppliers early.
Okay. That kind of dovetails into the next question, is it's dealing with the best practice on how to reduce delivery costs. So they want to know specifically, do you have a best practice that maybe one that you haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah, I would say that would be similar to the answer I just gave, is partnering with those freight customers. I'm a real fan of working with people that have expertise. Not everybody has all the answers. So creating that network of help around your organization is going to help you be more successful. And that's where we leverage, is those freight partners to help us do that. So if we're bidding a big proposal and we're not even sure if it's coming our way, we'll reach out to those folks as we're doing the proposal and take their input. And maybe we modify some of the design in our proposal to accommodate freight to decrease the cost and the lead time to get it to the end point.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Our next question is dealing with the FAI process. They want to know, how do you account for labor hours associated with the FAI process?
A lot of that for us comes from experience. So we have a system that allows us to track by operation all of our team as they execute the program. So we have a history of FAI's work that we've done on the program, or different programs. And what we want to do is, one, understand the requirements first and see if they're similar to other requirements we've executed in the past. And most times they are. And then we, during the proposal process, partner with the team that's going to be executed. We're fortunate to have a great quality team that works on those FAIs. So we'll bring them into the conversation, discuss with them what we're bidding and what the proposal looks like, and then get their input on what they think it's going to be time. And because we've done due diligence in the bill of materials, the other thing I'd recommend, because the bill of material drives a lot of those FAIs. So if you have a solid bill of material in your proposal, then you can leverage that with your quality team to see what the impact's going to be for hours.
Okay. And our next question is looking for a difference between COTS and mil spec. So what is the typical cost differential for a COTS part and its custom or mil spec equivalent?
I would say typically it's 3 to 10x. It's kind of a trap if you're in your proposal thing to try to apply a multiplier to it. You really want to do the due diligence and go out and source the component and get a proposal for it for your proposal, because they can vary significantly. Nuts, bolts, hardware, that kind of stuff's pretty easy to get pricing on. But when you're looking at, the proverbial hammer, the $5 hammer versus the $500 hammer, then you really need to leverage your engineering team to be able to look at it and see what kind of impact it could have. Like I say, that example I gave earlier, I think it was the $500 part that turned into a $15,000 part. That's real. So that can happen as well. So definitely leverage your engineering community and make sure they're partnering with the sourcing team to get as much validation as you can in the early stages.
Okay. All right. And another viewer is curious about, what is the largest project you have ever been able to ship?
Oh man, the largest one was nearly 60 feet. It was 16 feet tall and 14 feet wide. It was one where, again, partnering with the logistic companies, there was like 10 trailers that could haul it in the United States. And if we would have reached out, the week before it was ready to ship and just expected somebody to haul it, it wouldn't have happened. So we partnered with somebody early. And again, that goes back to what I'm saying. I'd recommend partnering with those folks early, and it was nearly, I think, 120,000 pounds. So we've done some big stuff. And if you're doing big stuff as well, or getting in the market to start doing some big stuff, leverage those transport companies, because if you're not an expert in that area, there are surprises that will get you.
It kind of segues into part two. It's a two-part question. So what is the shipping time for that project as compared to standard over the road truck shipping?
Yeah, I don't remember that one specifically, but I can give like approximates. So typically if you drew a straight line on the map like you were driving in your car, it would take 3 to 4 days. And what happens is, before these large equipment can be transported, they actually have to drive the route. And so the route is planned, and they make sure that they can fit underneath all the overpasses, all the power lines, the roads can handle the weights. So the original, it would be going through like 4 states, I think it was, or something like that. And we ended up going through 12. That just gives you the idea of the big U they had to go around and zigzag to make sure they were on roads that could haul the equipment. Could be significant. So yeah, you could go from a few days to a few weeks pretty easy on that large equipment like that.
Wow, it's fascinating. All right, I'm checking the board here. I don't see any other questions. We still have a couple of minutes. If you want to submit anything, now is the time. I'll wait a few seconds here.
Yeah, and we appreciate everybody joining. We try to keep these short because we're, conscious of everybody's time, and we want to do them regularly. So just to give people an opportunity to pick up on some things that we experience, and then also answer any questions that you have. So feel free to ask.
All right, well, that completes all the questions that were submitted, so the board is clear there. Hopefully this information webinar gave you a better understanding of how specific requirements can impact your cost and delivery. You will receive an on-demand link to view or share this webinar in your inbox shortly, so please share it if you will. Our next webinar is scheduled for July 28th at 10 o'clock in the morning. And we're going to be discussing EMI and tactical packages. And you'll also receive an invite for that one as well.
Thank you, Sean, for having me. Appreciate it. And we'll look forward to the next one.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And just a reminder, please don't forget to complete a short survey. It's only 5 questions. It'll take you all about 2 minutes. That'll be emailed to you after this session is concluded. And we would appreciate your feedback. So thank you all for attending again. Have a great week and happy 4th of July in advance. We appreciate it. Thank you.